Alter Your Health podcast, your source of information and inspiration to promote the holistic transformation of your health and the health of our planet. I'm your host, Dr. Benjamin Alter, and thank you for taking the time out of your busy day to share this time with me and our guest today. I'm really excited to share this episode, this conversation with a pioneer of the field of mind-body medicine. In this conversation, we talk about how the field of mind-body medicine came to be, both from kind of a research scientific base, as well as kind of how it wove into the social, cultural context of conventional medicine. And we reflect on how the evolution of the healthcare system, where we're at today and where we're going. And that has been the field that our guest, Dr. Joan Borysenko, has been steeped in for decades. So she has tons of experience and wisdom to share, starting from her own connection with holistic health and healing from a very young age. She shares that intimate story and so much more. So I'll just give a brief introduction of our guest, Dr. Joan Borysenko, for those of you who are not yet connected with her work. Dr. Borysenko is a world-renowned expert in the mind-body connection. Her work has been foundational in an international healthcare revolution that recognizes the role of meaning and the spiritual dimensions of life as an integral part of health and healing. After graduating magna cum laude from Bryn Mawr College in 1967, Dr. Borysenko earned her doctorate in medical sciences from the Harvard Medical School, where she completed postdoctoral training in cancer cell biology. Her first faculty position was at the Tufts University College of Medicine in Boston, but after the death of her father from cancer, she became more interested in the person with the illness than in the disease itself, and she returned to Harvard Medical School, where she completed a second postdoctoral fellowship, this time in the new field of behavioral medicine. Under the tutelage of Dr. Herbert Benson, who first identified the relaxation response and brought meditation into medicine, she was awarded a Medical Foundation Fellowship and completed her third postdoctoral fellowship in psychoneuroimmunology. In the early 1980s, Dr. Borysenko co-founded a mind-body clinic with Dr. Benson and Dr. Ilan Kutz and became licensed as a psychologist and was appointed instructor in medicine at the Harvard Medical School. Her years of clinical experience and research culminated in 1987 with the publication of her New York Times best-selling book, Minding the Body, Mending the Mind. Since then, she has authored or co-authored 16 other books and numerous audio and video programs, including the public television special Inner Peace for Busy People. She is the founding partner of Mindbody Health Sciences, located in Santa Fe, New Mexico. So that's where I connected with Dr. Borysenko for this lovely interview. And just a note, we did start with a meditation. So if you do have an opportunity to center yourself with this beautiful guided meditation with Dr. Joan Borysenko, I highly encourage you to close your eyes, deepen your breath, connect with yourself, and listen to this interview from a place of groundedness and connection. So let's just dive right in on that note. If you want to sit back, relax, and take a breath and enjoy this conversation with Dr. Joan Borysenko.
Out of the marrow of your bones and bringing in new energy. Aspects of this come from Greek Orthodox mysticism, and aspects of it are very similar to some of the practices of Tibetan Buddhism. And I find it really useful, very useful, in the difficult time that we live in, particularly because it helps you not lose energy to what these days we call negative empathy. When you have empathy with the pain and suffering of others, but you don't have enough distance from it, and therefore it activates the pain centers of your own brain, which pretty much disables your ability to be compassionate. We need to keep that little bit of distance so that we can meditate for others with compassion, do practices like loving kindness or Tonglen, taking in others' pain and returning really light to them, and our own sense of freedom. So I think it's great. And it's also great for somebody like you, Benjamin, who's a practitioner. I used to do it when I ran a Mindbody clinic at a hospital. I used to do it every morning before I would see patients. And it helped me to keep my energy in a good place. So, you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. Egg of light. We're going to do the briefest of brief forms of it. So,
excellent, yeah.
So I would suggest to all of us to just take a moment and find a position where your body feels very dignified and noble, where your back is straight and your shoulders are relaxed, your jaw is loose. And then just begin to notice the flow of your breathing without trying to change it in any way, just being mindful of the inflow of breath and the outflow, any way you like. And now imagine that there's a great star of light above our heads. And this is really the primal light of the universe, an intelligent quantum field of light. And allow that light, imagine it or feel it or think about it, however works for you. But bring that light down so that it flows over you like a waterfall, and it flows in through the crown of your head. And as it does so, imagine that that light can flow right through all the bones of your skull, the bones of your neck and vertebrae, the bones of your shoulders and clavicles and arms and fingers, almost like a skeleton filling with light, feeling that flow of life force energy, chi, Shakti, the life force itself flowing through now the bones of the ribs, the pelvis, the hips and thighs, the knees and bones of the lower leg and feet. And if you can just hold the image for a moment of that light flowing through the marrow of your bones, recharging your whole energy system with light. And imagine any used up chi, fatigue, disease going out through the bottoms of your feet as a kind of darkness. And Mother Earth will compost it. And now imagine that as that light moves through your bones, it's moving through all the soft tissue of your body as well. And if there's any place in your body where there is pain, tension, or disease, just direct the light there for a moment. And now imagine that that waterfall of light that's moving through your bones and all the tissues of your body is washing clean the boundaries of your heart and revealing an inner light within you that has always been there. That's your spiritual center. And you've been there many times at moments of awe or compassion, joy or love, forgiveness or gratefulness, hope. And as your heart light begins to shine out, imagine that that light joins with the light from above and moves out around your body like a luminous egg, about 3 feet above and below you and 3 feet all around you. And this aura of living light, living liquid light, is protective and healing. And so affirm for yourself that all of the thoughts and feelings and experiences from the external world that touch you, that touch your egg of light, those that are promoting harmony, will make it through the egg of light and touch you. But those things that promote disintegration instead, those thoughts, environmental factors, feelings, events, will bounce off your egg of light, and a blessing will be returned to the sender or the source. Imagining now that your own positive thoughts will get through the egg of light and reach others, but your own thoughts of despair or loss of hope or negativity will bounce off the interior of your egg of light, and a blessing of awakening and choice will emerge for you. And now, imagine that you could expand your egg of light to touch the people around you, to touch the people in your city, in your state, until you can expand it to touch the entire planet. And we'll end by wishing for ourself and all beings the most basic blessings of loving kindness. May we all be filled with loving kindness. May we be well. May we be peaceful and at ease. May we be happy. And so that's the egg of light.
That was very lovely. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Yeah, and here we are. I think that's a great place to start, and
It
it's a
is.
great energy to maintain, well, certainly throughout this conversation, but like you said, kind of throughout our day-to-day life in this crazy world that we're in.
That's right. It's a good way to help your resilience.
Yeah, I love how it started in the bone marrow. I was, was feeling like my stem cells, like on that level.
Right.
And then it got cosmic, from the stem cells to the cosmos, and everything in between. Yeah, so thank you.
Well, you tap into morphic fields that have been around for many thousands of years. With something like that that's rooted in different traditions. And so it's great. You don't have to create the field from scratch. It's there.
Yeah, well, I don't know if I guess we are creating a field from scratch, or we are creating, but yeah, we can just tap into that.
That's right.
Yeah. So, Dr. Joan Borysenko, first of all, thank you for, taking the time to be on this podcast and to, share your wisdom. And welcome.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And thanks for having me in your beautiful home here.
Thank you.
So yeah, I'd love to start by just knowing a little bit more about how you've honed in the world of mind-body medicine, which from when you began your journey, maybe that word didn't even exist.
Well, it was psychosomatic medicine in the old days. And the question people usually have about mind-body medicine is how did it start? What was the beginning of that field? And at the time that the field was beginning, I was actually a cancer cell biologist. I was on the faculty of Tufts Medical School. So I have a doctorate in cell biology, in postdoctoral work in cancer cell biology, and was just fascinated with how the body worked to start with, and fascinated with the question, how come sometimes it doesn't work so well? And why is it that cancer cells, which are essentially immortal cells, find themselves moving around in the body and they don't either have the mechanism to stop growing, so they invade, and why aren't they communicating with other cells, and why doesn't the immune cells recognize them? Now, I started out in that field in 1973, so we have a lot more answers to those questions now. The whole field of cancer research is changing. But while I was doing cancer research, I was also doing some very interesting research on healing. The Boston area, was at Harvard and Tufts at the same time for a few years. It's a long story, but I was working with a cardiologist, Dr. Herbert Benson, who first brought meditation into medicine. And when I graduated college, I had decided I was going to be a grad student at Harvard Medical School because of the work Benson was doing in the Department of Physiology with biofeedback. And to go back, I had been fascinated with yoga and yogis since I was a really little kid.
Yeah, how did that start? Where did that come from?
Well, there were two things that happened at around the same time. I'm not sure which was first. One of them was that I had what I think about now as a shamanic initiation. And our world of psychiatry would and did call it a psychotic break, which then I managed by developing obsessive compulsive disorder. And I hallucinated that headhunters were breaking into the house. I could see them, not quite manifest in this world. And I became convinced that since I was the only one in the family who saw the danger, I was the only one who could avert it. And so I quickly developed a huge variety of very creative rituals to get rid of headhunters. Everything from the typical hand washing to things like picking up a paper or a book and having to turn it upside down and read the whole thing upside down and backwards 3 times, which really hangs you up in school, I'll tell you. And if I was interrupted, I have to be careful not to go into that space when I talk about it. I would be overwhelmed with sheer terror. And at night, I would dream of it. So there was no respite, day or night, from the terror. And it's interesting that as a little kid, and as an older person too, from the time I was 8, I had gone to a Jewish girls' camp. And the director of that camp was the sort of person who was really capable of bringing a whole rowdy camp full of, 100 and some little girls into a state of great peace. And I remember we'd go into the beautiful pine grove by a lake on Friday night to do the Sabbath services, and it being so silent because she would really bring us into a state where some kind of divine presence, feminine presence, the Shekhinah, the feminine face of God, would come in. And it was the most meaningful part of my life to spend 8 weeks every summer at that camp. And when I got sick, I thought, when I had my shamanic initiation, I should say, I'm not going to be able to go to camp because, I'm just too crazy at this time. And this was about 6 months into it, as spring was rolling in and camp was coming closer. And I thought, let me try to recreate that state that we have at camp. And so I said to myself, actually, I sang to myself.
So you were like 10 years old? Or?
I was 10. I was in the fifth grade. I sang to myself some of the old prayers. For me, the voice and the sound of the voice internally and the vibration that it creates from the time that I was little was a resource for me. I could calm myself down. And it was sacred music, very ancient music. Mm-hmm. And so I sat and sang to myself and tried to recreate the state. And all of a sudden, I had this amazing experience for which I had zero contact, Benjamin. And what it was the terrible fear was replaced with literally perfect peace, like biblical peace that passeth understanding. And along with the peace was an incredible depth of inner knowing. And what I knew, first thing I knew is I could recover from this mental illness, and I knew exactly how to recover. It was really clear to me what needed to happen. And what needed to happen was to stop doing the rituals cold turkey. And then I thought, but how can I do that? I'm going to be so scared. It's clear, I'm in a good state now, but like, what about in 5 minutes when this is over? And I was sitting there, and all of a sudden I got the kind of inner sensation, go get a pencil and paper. And this poem formed in my mind. And I realized, and it was a poem that was like so descriptive of the space I was in, I realized, aha, I can memorize that poem. And when I need to do a ritual, I can say it and it will bring me back to a place of peace. And I called the poem The Light because that was also my first experience of divine light, of which I've had many, many in the years since that time. But the poem was, I called it The Light. Somewhere in the darkest night, there always shines a little light. This light up in the heavens shines to help our God watch over us. So when a small child is born, the light her soul does adorn. So when our only human eyes look up in the lightless skies, we must know, even though we cannot see, that this light burns far into the night to help our God watch over us. And makes me cry still. But that poem has been with me all my life and has really helped me be resilient because it gives me faith, because it's tied to the experience of being part of a larger whole, and a larger whole that, contrary to all our experience, is actually weaves reality out of love itself. And so when I had that experience, it led to, and then, to finish up the story, at the end of maybe 3, at tops 4 days, that was the end of all the headhunters, all the bad dreams, all of the whole thing. It just resolved it. And, this is not an experience that goes unnoticed. It's about as powerful as it gets.
I'm curious, did your family know what
my
was
family
happening?
knew. I went to a couple of really good psychiatrists in Boston.
Did they know about the inner healing that took place in that time? Or?
It's funny that you asked that question because you would have thought that somebody would have said something like, boy, just last Tuesday you were crazy. You seem well today. What happened? Mm-hmm. Nobody said a thing.
Yeah, it was like just kind of going along as if, Joan is Joan. And I'm sure that there was a noticeable shift.
30 years later, I asked about that.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They noticed that I got better, but my mother said they were afraid to even mention
Yeah, that's
it
what I was thinking.
'cause
Like
it
they
would.
don't want it, like you're delicate or something. But you speak
Exactly.
about this resiliency that poem brought.
Yeah.
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 Well, that's very touching.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, yes, it was. I think my parents just didn't want to touch it. I used to listen to them crying themselves to sleep at night. It gave me a tremendous amount of compassion, not only for people who have mental illness, but for their families who feel often so very helpless. And part of that, what grew out of that, is I think this happens for a lot of kids who are sick with something. You kind of want to grow up to relieve other people's suffering. So, I became interested in psychology and mental health. And then, funny thing, we were studying the brain in the 5th grade. We had a great science teacher. And of course, I began to think, well, what could happen in a brain that it filters reality in such a different way? It's like, how could that be? And then the biggest question for me was, okay, I've had a touch of that experience in the Pine Grove at camp, but no one ever talks about it. And I was completely sure that other people had had that experience of deep inner peace and light and, the kind of inner knowing. But I didn't know where to look. There's certainly in Hebrew school, it was never mentioned. So I thought, maybe some other religions, but what are you going to do? There was no internet. We had at home an Encyclopedia Britannica Junior, which is pretty much what you used, and then the school library that was not much on comparative religions in grade school. So little by little over the years, I began, my hobby is the exploration of world religions, particularly the mystical states where all rivers flow to the same place. And so there's a huge difference between religion and spirituality. That spirituality is that state that I found myself in. Is a great paper by a Harvard psychiatrist, George Valiant. And he said, if psychiatry went about promoting positive emotions rather than focusing only on the negative, we could get much further. And now I'm fascinated because really neuroscience and positive psychology have shown just that. There's now I'd say that so much of psychology and neuroscience is rapidly changing because we have the technology to promote these inner states. But just getting back to the field of mind-body medicine, so I had these interests pretty much all my life.
Yeah,
and,
it seems inevitable.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And the mind, body, and spirit, that sounds so trite now, but that's what it is. And that's why when I saw a program on television about a yogi who they locked him into a box with only enough oxygen to live for a single day, and for an hour. And, he could tell them he needed to come up or whatever, but a day later they finally brought him up because he had downregulated his metabolism to the point where he didn't need very much oxygen at all. Then what they did was they brought out literally a bed of nails. The yogi laid down on that bed of nails and a car ran over him. And when he got up, there wasn't even a nail mark in his back. There was nothing. And I thought to myself, how does that possibly happen? And then I realized there's more space, obviously, between atoms than there is matter. I was always thinking about stuff like this.
Wow. Yeah.
I won the science fair in physics a couple of years later in high school. But just always very interested in consciousness and in the nature of consciousness and in the nature of matter. So that really got me, and I thought, how did the yogis do it? And that was my first clue. I said, I bet they know how to get into this state. But there were no yogis around in Brookline, Massachusetts when I was growing up. Later in high school, we did have Ram Dass and Timothy Leary doing experiments with LSD of just a few miles away in Newton, Mass. But that was a whole other thing. But there was a burgeoning interest back then in the nature of consciousness. And so by the time I went through college, I double majored in biology and psychology, and I kept writing whatever, really simplistic papers I could at that time on the nature of consciousness, reality, and the body, things like that. That's why I ended up wanting to study biofeedback. And very quickly that field started to develop because almost at the same time, the Maharishi was kind of traveling through the United States, and college students in particular were learning TM. And some of those students at Harvard went to Herb Benson and said that they had observed that blood pressure got lower when people meditated, and one of his interests as a cardiologist was hypertension. So he wanted to study that. And there was already a graduate student at UCLA by the name of Keith Wallace who was studying the physiology of TM. And Benson and Wallace got together and wrote a paper looking at the physiology of TM, which Benson dubbed the relaxation response because it was the body's opposite of the fight or flight response. That was the earliest kind of research on meditation. And then he realized it wasn't just TM, it was anything that quieted the inner dialogue of the mind. Now we would say anything that quieted the default mode network circuitry in the mind, the midline circuitry that does what's called selfing. It's all about I, me, mine, self-referential worrying and all of that. And any kind of meditation or contemplative practice actually calms that down quite a bit. But what happened now, round about this time, was, number one, people began to recognize that the body was not made of separate systems, but it was a whole. Candace Pert, who was an amazing scientist, she'd written over 300 papers, and she was really an iconoclast. But she was the one who discovered the binding sites for endorphins. And back then, this now seems so commonplace. Back then, it was a big deal. Like, what? The body has binding sites for its own endogenous morphine. That's the word. Endorphin comes from endogenous morphine. And it was recognized, we must make it in response to different states and, emotional states. And Candace recognized that the brain made a series of neuropeptides that crossed the blood-brain barrier that bound to receptor sites on cells, and that changed our physiology. And that this happened across all systems in milliseconds. And so she said there is no such thing as a mind and a body. There's only one thoroughly integrated body-mind system. And she was the beginning of systems thinking.
So when was that on a timeline?
That on the timeline would have been in the late 70s to the mid-80s. I think her book must have come out, Molecules of Emotion, in the mid-80s. At the same time, the whole field of immunology was gearing up. Unfortunately, largely what gave it a big kick forward was the AIDS epidemic, which developed in the early 80s. And then of course, there was a lot of interest in can you change the immune system with your mind. And that field is called psychoneuroimmunology. I did research in that field for a number of years. And I was already doing this kind of research when I was still at Tufts as a cancer cell biologist. In my spare time, I did things like there was quite a very interesting guy by the name of Itzhak Bentov, who wrote a book popular back then called Stalking the Wild Pendulum. He was very interested in the distant healing, the effects of energy fields, energy medicine. And there was already a very interesting literature about field effects on the growth of cancer cells. And so Ben and I, after the end of the workday, we would go and use the equipment and try to measure things like the effects of sending distant healing or prayer on simple systems like the surface tension of water, things like that. And then I was fooling around with Kirlian photography and all kinds of things of that nature, trying to really understand the mechanics of healing, including such things as spontaneous remission, because every once in a while, from virtually any illness, somebody who's expected to die imminently will suddenly get better without having treatment that can affect that. And at that time, the Institute of Noetic Science had published a really big monograph on spontaneous healing. And I had been studying it myself because of my interest in cancer. And it's quite interesting because what people often have in common is that, number one, it's a little bit like my childhood experience. You know you can be healed. You have a strong knowing that healing is possible. Second, you know that you personally can heal. And third, you have a transformative spiritual experience. And that doesn't guarantee that you'll have a remission, but it guarantees that you will heal in the most basic healing, which is kind of overcoming the sense of separation and recognizing your interdependence and interconnectedness with all that is. So in any case, all of this was going on. The field of P&I was developing. Benson had started to use meditation. Then along came John Kabat-Zinn right about this same time, early 80s. And he brought mindfulness into medicine. And it's amazing because his work has really changed the world. He popularized something that many people were practicing, but it was more of an esoteric practice than something that you would simply do to relieve your stress or
right. It didn't have any sort of practical implication. It was just kind of this, do for fun kind of thing.
Yeah,
no real
it was
tangible.
like, you would do it. There were plenty of Buddhist practitioners around to whom mindfulness was very important, but its relationship to well-being at multiple levels in a Western sense, that was what John really contributed, which was a massive, huge, amazing
really
contribution. So all of that was going on at the same time. And now, of course, the research on meditation is so much more sophisticated, both in terms of functional magnetic resonance studies, so you see what's going on with the brain circuitry, and what practice can do for people, both long-term practice and short-term practice. Now we know that 12 minutes of meditation a day seems to be the magical number that will produce all the good physiological changes and some of the ability to dampen down that default mode network and quit ruminating and selfing and being separate and opening up a whole creative range of possibilities. So all of that's very interesting. And that largely came out of the fact that the Dalai Lama is interested in science. And you figure, of course he is. He's interested in karma, in cause and effect. And that makes him, he's always, since he's been a little boy, taking apart radios. And so he came to Harvard in 1979. That's when I met him for the first time, and wanted to start collaborative studies, which our laboratory, Bensons Laboratory, did. Benson went with a group of researchers from Harvard and the Natick, Massachusetts Army labs, which study, clothing in highly hot or cold places, because one of the kinds of meditation that Benson studied was called Tumo Yoga. Tumo in Tibetan means fierce woman. It's the life force energy. And the practice of Tumo Yoga, you bring that energy up the chakras. And the monks liberate a tremendous amount of body heat. And they can actually dry wet sheets in freezing caves during the full moon in February, Tibetan New Year. So it's quite a practice. And Benson was able to show, without changing core temperature, obviously there's a lot of vasodilation that's involved, the monks could indeed liberate a tremendous amount of heat externally. I always laugh about that, because I think the first time I had a hot flash, I said to myself, these guys have been sitting there in caves for thousands of years learning to do what happens for every single woman as a virtue of nature. There's literally the fierce woman energy rises. But all of that research began to happen. And then all with the advent then of all the fMRI studies and the collaborative studies between His Holiness, psychologists, and neuroscientists, whole new fields of study opened up. And at the same time, of course, the human genome was not only being mapped, but the epigenome was being mapped. And people started to say, wow, look what meditation does to the epigenome. And as we know, those are marks either on the DNA or on the protein matrix that holds the DNA in place in a cell, to either open up genes for transcription, open for business, or close them down.
And also the telomeres.
And that, yes, and it does. It lengthens the telomeres, which is so very important, especially since stress and adverse childhood experiences and trauma really decreases the length of telomeres. I'm very concerned about our kids and very concerned about the amount of trauma in the population, adverse childhood experiences. And, someone who has 4 or 5 categories, there are 10 categories of adverse childhood experiences, lives about 20 years less than somebody who doesn't. That's an enormous thing. Like the rate of suicide goes up 12 times if you have 4 adverse childhood experiences, things like neglect, or watching violence toward your mother, or not having 2 parents in the home, even a single parent household, or certainly being sexually abused, or having an addict in the household, or having household members in jail. So you just get 1 point for each one of these. But for example, we're in New Mexico as we speak, Benjamin, and we're 50th in child welfare, which is really terrible.
Wow.
And, kind of looking for ways to improve things, because poverty breeds adverse childhood experiences.
I like to think or hope or believe that adversity, seeds opportunity for transformation, but I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, absolutely. Trauma opens a doorway to transformation, but when you've got poverty, when you have abuse and violence and neglect. Once the trauma system is activated, and these are people who often, have multiple triggers for PTSD, because all the action is in the amygdala, and the prefrontal cortex, the executive part of the brain, does not develop well in kids like that. It's definitely retarded in its development. They don't have the same ability necessarily to find the resources, internal and external, to help make that shift from literally chaos to opportunity. But I do believe, as you do, that it's never too late. It's always possible. And it takes a lot of work. We have a long way to go in terms of understanding the treatment of trauma.
Yeah, well, that has kind of, I guess maybe that's a good segue into the next chapter of this conversation. You talked about the the kind of formation of this field, and obviously this field exists in part to support the people with trauma and adversity and struggling to overcome and transcend disease of the mind and the body. So maybe, are there any kind of highlights from your kind of more clinical, practical career where working with people or witnessing transformation in others through mind-body practices or experiences?
Oh, yes. I ran a mind-body clinic at that time. It was called the Beth Israel Hospital in Boston. And then it grafted onto another one of the Harvard teaching hospitals. It's now the Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. But I ran a mind-body clinic at those hospitals for most of the 1980s. And what I saw was really remarkable. I started with a cancer clinic. And the reason why I started with a cancer clinic, number one, I was a cancer cell biologist, which is helpful. But my dad had developed leukemia and was given a drug that unfortunately led to a horrifying mental condition. He developed really manic psychosis. You couldn't talk to him, he couldn't sit, he was aggressive, restless, unable to focus. And the doctor kept saying, well, gee, too bad, but he needs it. And there was nowhere to get help. And eventually he was taken off the drug because he had to have a surgery. And very quickly he came back into his right mind. But during the recovery from surgery, he waited one night for my mom to go to sleep. And they were living in Florida in a condo on the 37th or 38th floor or something. And he simply jumped to his death one night rather than endure the side effects of that drug. And here I was, a cancer cell biologist, and I thought, what am I missing? I know everything about molecules, and I know nothing about the human experience of cancer. And that's when I decided. I went back and finished, I got licensed as a clinical psychologist, and at the same time resumed work with Herb Benson, because, I'd called and said, hey, what about this Simonton thing, this imagery for people with cancer? Do you think it works? And he said, well, we need experiments to find out whether that will actually work for someone. And it just so happened, one of these great synchronous events, like the day I called, he had just gotten a grant approved to retrain MDs and PhDs in behavioral medicine. So I did a postdoc with him for a couple of years, and then got licensed, and then along with an Israeli psychiatrist, Ilan Kutz, we formed this mind-body clinic. And so the cancer clinic was the very first thing that I did. And it was really remarkable because just in terms of what people could expect, anxiety and depression went way down. It was so wonderful for people with cancer to be able to talk from their heart about their emotions, about the challenges, about the difficulties, but in an atmosphere where transformation was really possible. These were the lucky people. They had the resources to get to a hospital to do these things. And oftentimes, people who'd been through the groups wanted to come back and be a volunteer for other groups. And one of the greatest effects, I think, on health is social support and a deep sense of connection. And often when people are ill, they isolate, they lose the very connection that's needed for healing. Yeah. So that was really important. And in terms of the actual meditation and imagery, I tried very hard to be able to do studies of this. But for example, I remember doing a feasibility study of how many patients with cancer it would take to see if our program, gave them a longer, what's called disease-free interval. And it would have taken something like 25,000 patients.
In order to create a statistically significant scenario,
yeah, because you do what's called a power analysis to see if you're going to make statistical significance, how many patients it'll take. And then...
Just pausing there, do you think that's one of the maybe limitations in the field of it, maybe holding back the advancement is just the maybe lack of scientific data from the lack of the powerful studies we're talking about?
Well, yes, in terms of that kind of outcome, for sure. It's very hard to do that research. In fact, it's not feasible to do that research, and that's a problem.
To narrow in the variables in that kind of way.
And so you get a lot of studies that involve a small number of people, but even if it's going in the right direction, you can't make any conclusions from that. This is an area where false news is not admitted.
Yeah, I was going to say, just there's obviously no shortage of anecdotes, but for some reason that doesn't mean anything to the whole maybe system or field at large.
Well,
but maybe it does.
The reason for that is the question always is, what was somebody's getting better due to? If they were taking drugs for cancer, maybe it was the drugs. If you're doing a drug study, you realize there's a better than 50% chance, generally speaking, that it was due to the placebo effect.
Right.
That's a very powerful effect. That was one of the first mind-body effects that became a subject of study. Why do people recover? Just because they believe they can. That's most
mind-body
powerful
medicine.
thing. That's mind-body medicine.
Yeah.
So how do you know it's not the placebo effect? Then it's like, okay, you're seeing a patient. How do we know it's not the Benjamin effect? There's something about the interpersonal connection with you particularly that's healing, and some other practitioner wouldn't have gotten that.
Yeah, or the resonance between the two people.
Exactly. There's some resonant field that's created. Or maybe it's actually due to variable X, Y, and Z. It's due to the yoga practice. It's due to the mindfulness. It's due to eliciting more positive emotions. There's too many variables. And again, statistically, when there are a lot of possible variables, you will get what look to be significant results that are just an artifact of having too many variables. So it's just hard to study.
Yeah, well, that's okay. I mean, I think that's okay because I'm curious to know what your thoughts are in terms of, I often think about what's really most important is not necessarily the end result or the cure or the remission of cancer or any other condition, but just someone's experience in life throughout it. And that, I feel like, is much more measurable.
That's much more measurable, and there are big studies of that. There's a study, for example, of over 2,400 people who practiced, I think, 5 different kinds of what they call contemplative activities, meditative activities, could have been any kind of meditation or mindfulness or centering prayer. I forget the other two, but anything like that, yoga or qigong. And they were much less neurotic, much less depressed, much more likely to help others, much higher in agreeableness. And the biggest epidemic that we have in this country that's also affecting our college kids tremendously is depression. That's a huge national health crisis with very bad outcomes because people commit suicide, people get addicted to opiates or other substances, and that's a major problem.
Yeah, what do you think is the root of that?
I think it's several-fold. At one level, I think it's toxicity, all the poisons in the environment. At another level, I think it's due to the way we've messed up our gut microbiota, due to the poisons, due to the standard American diet, and the lack of fiber, lack of prebiotics, so we can't feed our probiotics. And so between the bad food and the poison, most people have got an inflammatory process going on. And there's a lot of data accumulating about the role of inflammation in depression.
Oh, wow, yeah.
And then
that makes sense, considering that your body is just in this kind of chronic stress, even though it's not a psychological stress, it's inflammatory stress.
It's an inflammatory stress. It's huge, and that's affecting your nervous system. And it's affecting vagal activity. It's affecting a lot of stuff. Then on top of all of that, you have, the advent of the internet and the advent of kids sitting in the same room texting each other, and the lack of what is the singularly most important thing to the human nervous system, and that is we co-regulate each other. And there's now a whole very interesting field of interpersonal neurobiology. This is largely the work of a group of people at UCLA. Dan Siegel is the psychiatrist who's really been the one who spearheaded research in interpersonal neurobiology. But his idea of the mind is that it's an emergent function of our entire system. Now we know the brain is not just in the head. There's a brain in the gut. There's a brain in the heart. All of the membranes of every cell are brains that are making things.
Pretty amazing to think about it that way.
It is.
But yes,
It is. We're just a big, giant, old walking brain.
Yeah.
Very intelligent, but we don't stop at our body. That field of intelligence that is responsible for regulating the flow of energy and information across time. Those are Dan Siegel's part of his definition. That nervous system, that brain, is both embodied within us and embedded in all of our relationships. And you think, well, I live here because my relationship with nature regulates me. That's very important to me. I learned that long ago. I can't live in a city. I can't live in a place that's noisy. I need that. So I'm being regulated by nature. I'm being regulated by all kinds of things in my environment, including other people. And we live in an incredibly noisy world. It's unbelievable how noisy it is. People, I happened to be in a company about a month ago working largely with millennial employees. And as they were being given forms to fill out, they were listening to this loud, rhythmic music with words. And later on, I asked a couple of them, I said, does it help you to concentrate? And they said, oh, yes. Several of them said, we really, whenever we're like doing anything that requires concentration, we have to have that kind of music. And I thought, oh boy, nervous systems have changed since my day.
Yeah,
It's
well,
like, shut up.
I've personally had the experience of sometimes, being in a world where with a lot of noise and a lot of busyness, and then I go out into the woods or into nature with quiet, and I feel almost kind of sick and hungover for like maybe a half a day or a day. My as my nervous system kind of recalibrates to, I guess, what more of its natural state, but sometimes it's so used to this noise.
Yeah, and I mean, all of that is, I think, very disruptive
Yeah.
of our nervous system. So we have record levels of anxiety and depression, which is, of course, not helped by our political situation. And whatever side one is on, it doesn't matter.
A lot of outside kind of craziness as we started this
Yes.
conversation.
Yeah, the field is crazy, so we have to learn to be resilient.
Yeah.
And
well, I love that. And on that note, maybe after this long, fruitful career studying like the whole, field of fields, I see a field of fields. What are some of the kind of takeaways at this point in your life like what are the important things to weave into our individual lives to increase our own individual resiliency in this crazy world?
What the research says is
Yeah.
the cultivation of gratitude and compassion are what are most transformative for people. In the field of positive psychology, there's something called the VIA strengths. VIA stands for values and action. And there are 24 like signature strengths that people have. It might be courage or a good sense of justice or compassion or love or curiosity or humor. There's 24 of those. And we all have got these strengths, but you can take something called the VIA Strength Survey, which is free online, and it'll tell you like what are your core strengths. And if you recognize those strengths and you use them to solve problems in your life, you'll do better. But anybody can develop any of these strengths. And in terms of strengths that are very transformative, the most transformative in terms of creating well-being is gratitude. And there's a whole field of how to get grateful. And the best is this wonderful psychologist, Rick Hansen. He wrote several books. Buddha's Brain is one of them. Resilient is another. He says you have to install the good because we come with a built-in negativity bias because that's how we survived, is like, tiger over there. And we tend to let the good just slide off us. You look out the window, it's beautiful. Well, that minute's gone, back to like paying the bills or doing whatever.
Yeah, you can look out and see all sorts of beautiful, lovely people, and it's like, yeah, but this.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And so the key is to install the good. So if, for example, we look out there and right away, my heart kind of opens, I relax, I love the colors of the mountains outside, that rich red earth of Santa Fe and the beautiful clouds and sky. And if I hang with that for 10 or 20 seconds, I start to wire new circuitry.
Yeah.
And if you do that 5 or 6 or 8 or 10 times a day, you can't complain that it's taking you a lot of time. It really doesn't take much in the way of time. But you're building brain circuits, drop by drop, installing the good. And if before you go to bed at night, you think about one thing during the day that surprised you, that delighted you, that brought love in your heart or whatever it was, and you hang with that just before bedtime, that is a really great time to hang with it for a little bit longer. And it's wonderful. It changes everything. So that's one little example, but you can take any kind of wonderful state that you experience and start to install it as a trait so it really becomes one of those inner values, but you just have to notice it and hang with it. Mm-hmm. And that's the simplest thing you can do.
I love that. It doesn't need to be complex.
Right.
You mentioned before about nutrition and about how maybe that's in some part at the root of a lot of mental health conditions in our world today, amongst obviously physical health. Yeah. I'm curious what your relationship is between nutrition and spiritual awakening or conscious awakening, and if you think that, sometimes I notice that people have maybe one thing happens and then the other. They change their diet and then they have some sort of shift in consciousness, or maybe they have a shift in consciousness that, informs dietary changes. Do you have any?
It certainly is very, very interesting, because my own opinion of it is there is no one size fits all diet anyhow. Mm-hmm. It's not mm-hmm. like you'll get transcendent if you're a vegan. It could kill you instead. Mm-hmm. Depends on your physiology. Mm-hmm. Some people will thrive as vegans. Some people are, like His Holiness, are obligatory carnivores. Mm-hmm. There weren't a whole lot of vegetables up mm-hmm. in the Himalayas. It was, due to yaks largely, that was the major protein source. And the major source, and we do understand that from looking around the world, that there is something to genetically what our metabolic furnace evolved to be able to eat. And it's not so simple as looking at your blood type or anything like that, because people now also have a tremendous number of sensitivities. The amount of people with environmental sensitivities due to all the toxicity grows tremendously. And a lot of those people they're allergic to certain supplements. They are allergic to different foods. And it's become, I think, really quite an interesting science to say, what is it? Some things we know. For example, in terms of states of consciousness, if you go on a ketogenic diet, you will definitely have a very clear high state. And that's why I think fasting produces ketosis. And it often produces, kind of spiritual states of mind. I have a friend, Sissy Brady Rogers, who's worked a lot with girls with anorexia, and she says actually that particular high state is a side effect of the anorexia that is very rewarding to some people. It makes it very hard to give it up. We don't think about that, getting high from starving yourself, but it's definitely there. But I figure, okay, I went to Dharamsala. It's a poor place. Mostly what people are eating there is, like all cultures, there's always some kind of simple carb that's cheap and easy to cook. There it's these big fluffy white dumplings and whatever meat can be found, and very few vegetables. And yet these lamas are very highly evolved spiritually. So
yeah, that's a really good point. Well, that's a really excellent point. So it sounds like, if I'm hearing you correctly, it's really a matter, maybe not as much the individual foods as much as it is the toxin exposure.
I think it has to do with it's overdetermined. There are so many variables that feed into it. That's great.
Well, on that note, what are some other things nowadays that you're interested in? I know nutrition is one of them, but where's kind of this journey taking you?
Oh, well, I'd say that my single greatest interest is narrative, the effect of story on our body and on our lives. An old friend of mine, Carolyn Mace, once made the very pithy comment. She said, your biography becomes your biology. And it's so true. That's what happens. People stuck in trauma, they keep rerunning the same grievance story over and over and over, and that's making big, juicy old brain circuits from doing that. And for example, telling a story differently, there was a study of women who'd left abusive men, and those women were, half of them were put in a forgiveness group and half of them in an assertiveness training group. And you would have thought the assertiveness training group might have benefited them more because they developed better boundaries to keep these low-down, dirty dogs out of their life. But the forgiveness group was very interesting. What it worked on was changing your narrative. Forgiveness really means freedomness. How do you set yourself free? It's not about condoning someone's bad behavior. I mean, it's nice if you can develop empathy, but what you have to do is change your mind so that you're not in that same stuck place. And what they did was they said, okay, you can tell your grievance story once, write it down once. Now you have to tell a different story. You have to really think about what did you do? What strengths did you use? What resources did you call upon in order to develop the incredible courage that it takes to leave an abusive relationship? And as they wrote about their strengths and the development of their strengths, it reframed the experience for them, so that it was transformational, like this difficulty led to something that made my life better. And now I can use those strengths and other things that I do. So character strengths are an important part, I think, of storytelling and looking within narratives. I was just actually last night recording a little video teaser for a workshop that I'll be doing at a retreat center next month called Writing Down the Light. And it's looking at the difficulties of life in a more appreciative way, because we all have difficulties. We all have negative emotions. But those things, when the going gets rough, that's when our patterns become most obvious to us. And that's when you have the greatest chance of breakthrough. And as people look through their life, particularly as you get older, I also do some memoir writing workshops. We're all looking, what is the meaning of my life? What have I been doing here? And the earlier that you kind of key in on the visible and invisible threads of grace that weave your life, the happier you become.
The earlier you key in on the invisible threads that weave your life, the happier you become. And what I take that to mean is just appreciating the miracles, the ordinary and extraordinary miracles.
That's right.
Yeah.
And appreciating times in the darkness as harbingers of the light.
I love that. Well, maybe that's a great place to end, Joan. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your journey and your story. And it's a really inspiring one, and I'm grateful.
Thank you very much for having me, Benjamin.
All right, it's been a pleasure. Peace and love. Until next time.